Shalom, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at the Essenes as described by Josephus, among other historians, and we're going to compare and contrast that to what we know about the early Jewish Christian groups from other historians, and we're going to ask ourselves, are they the same group of people? Or is the Jewish Christian groups, do they fall underneath the same umbrella as the term Essene? So we know up front that the Essenes share a lot of similar traits as the Ebionites or the Nazarenes or the Essenes. They all lived in community, were vegetarian, scorned wealth, did not swear oaths, rejected slavery, and abstained from war. So these sources that we have on the Essenes primarily comes from Josephus. A lot of the other sources tend to just regurgitate the information he gives, although we do get some additional info from some of these other historians, and it appears that they may have had a slightly different version of Josephus. Of course, back then books were handwritten, so over time we may be missing some of the information that was originally presented by Josephus. And Josephus himself made more than one version of his writings. For instance, he made one that was in the language of Aramaic, and then he also made one that was in the language of Greek. So we're going to be comparing these different historians, and we're going to see what similarities we can bring forward. So we're going to start off, and we're pretty much going to follow Josephus' writings in Wars of the Jews. Starting in Book 2, he says, "For there are 3 philosophical sects among the Jews, the followers of the first of which are the Pharisees, the second the Sadducees, the third sect, which pretends to a severer discipline, are called Essenes. These last are Jews by birth and seem to have a greater affection for one another than the other sects have. These Essenes reject pleasures as an evil, but esteem continence and the conquest over our passions to be a virtue." Now, notice right up front that there's only 3 sects mentioned. The Pharisees and the Sadducees we're very familiar with from the New Testament. But the third sect, the Essenes, are not even mentioned in the apostolic writings at all. And there's no mention by Josephus of the Nazarenes or any of the Jewish Christian groups. Now, Josephus lived in Judea. He was born about the time that Yeshua was crucified, and he lived in Judea for 40 years and was there at the destruction of Jerusalem. And here we are a couple of decades later when he's writing these words. So he lived in Judea, and if we take the testimony in the book of Acts to be historical, that there were thousands of Jews that were added to this sect of the Nazarenes, then why does Josephus not mention them? And likewise, why was there no mention of the Essenes in the New Testament? What I'm hoping to show evidence for in this video is that the reason for both of those questions is because the Essenes and the Nazarenes were the same group. Now, whether the Essenes were, the term Essene was like a blanket term for several sects, and the Nazarenes were one of those sects, we may never know. But it does seem that the groups are definitely related, and so we're going to get into that as we go on. Josephus goes on to say, "They neglect wedlock, but choose out other persons' children while they are still pliable and fit for learning, and esteem them to be of their own kindred, and from them and form them according to their own manners. They do not absolutely deny the fitness of marriage and the succession of mankind thereby continued, but they guard against the licentious behavior of women and are persuaded that none of them preserve their fidelity to one man. So, notice that they take in orphans, that's one of the traits that Josephus mentions, is that the Essenes don't typically marry, they would rather adopt children. Now, he does later on mention that some of the Essenes, that there is a different sects, and some of the sects do encourage marriage. But if we just stick with this first statement for now, and then let's turn to the writings of Clement, where we have Kepha saying to Zacchaeus, when he makes him a mavaker over a local assembly, he says, so suitably honor Zechariah, Morim, useful attendants, widows who have lived well, orphans as children of the Yahad. But wherever there is need of any provision for an emergency, contribute altogether. So Kepha is referring to orphans as children of the Yahad, of the local assembly. Speaking of himself, he says, for we, that is, I, my brother Andrew, have grown up from our childhood not only orphans, but also extremely poor. So again, you see that Kepha is saying that him and his brother were orphans. We also meet a couple of men, Niceta and Aquila. But speaking about their mother, in Homilies 2:19, says, there is amongst us one Justa, a Syrophoenician by race, a Canaanite, whose daughter was oppressed with a grievous disease. And she came to our Lord, crying out and entreating that he would heal her daughter. So we know this from the gospel stories in Matthew 15 and Mark 7 about the woman who was a Syrophoenician and kept asking Yeshua to cast this demon out of her daughter. And Yeshua says, it's not right to give the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And she answers, says, yes, master, but even the dogs at the table eat from the children's crumbs. And so then Yeshua goes ahead and heals her daughter of the demon. Well, this is that same woman according to Homilies. And then later on in Homilies 8, it says, now the woman who brought up us, Nicetas and Aquila, was a proselyte of the Jews, an altogether worthy person of the name of Justa. She adopted us as her own children, and zealously brought us up in all the learning of the Greeks, but we, becoming discreet with our years, were strongly attached to her religion, and we paid good heed to our culture, in order that, disputing with the other nations, we might be able to convince them of their error. So the point here is that this woman, Justa, once her daughter was healed, she became a follower of Yeshua, and she ended up taking in Niceta and Aquila as her own children. So again, you see this this repeated pattern of orphans in the early Jewish Christian writings. Going on, Josephus says, moreover, there's another order of Essenes who agree with the rest as to their way of living and customs and laws, but differ from them in the point of marriage, as thinking that by not marrying they cut off the principal part of human life, which is the prospect of succession, nay, rather, that if all men should be of the same opinion, the whole race of mankind would fail. So that's where he follows up by saying that there are some sects within the Essenes that do believe in marriage. And we know from the apostolic writings that many of the apostles had wives, so that would, of course, if the Nazarenes were Essenes, then that would obviously include their sect also. He said, these men are despisers of riches, and so very communicative as raises our admiration. Nor is there anyone to be found among them who hath more than another, for it is a law among them that those who come to them must let what they have be in common to the whole order, insomuch that among them there is neither an appearance of poverty or excess of riches, but each one's possessions are intermingled with every other's possessions, and so there is, as it were, one patrimony among the brethren. They also have stewards appointed to take care of their common affairs, who every one of them have no separate business for any but what is for the use of them all. So we see that it's not so much that they lived in poverty, it's just that they didn't have anything extra. We'll get that defined a little bit more as we go on. Philo says that they are alone of all men, having been originally poor and destitute, and that too rather from their own habits and ways of life than from any real deficiency of good fortune, are nevertheless accounted very rich, judging contentment and frugality to be great abundance, as in truth they are. So it's not necessarily that they're poor, it's just that they don't have more than they need. They're very frugal with their money. They don't go out and buy, a whole wardrobe full of clothes. They just need a couple of clothes to wear to get them by. In the Pinarian, Epiphanius says, but he, Ebion, is making a completely false accusation, this horrid serpent with his poverty of understanding. For Ebion, translated from Hebrew to Greek, means poor, and Ebionites themselves, if you please, boastfully claim that they are poor because they sold their possessions in the apostles' time and laid them at the apostles' feet and went over to a life of poverty and renunciation, and thus they are called poor by everyone. So again, you see the same trait as described by Josephus, where they share everything in common, and that's the reason for their apparent poverty. The Nazarene Acts, Kepha says, but maybe, although you live with me, speaking to Clement, you do not know my manner of life. I live on bread alone, with olives, and seldom even with pot herbs. And my dress is what you see, a tunic with a tallit. And having these, I require nothing more. This is sufficient for me, because my mind does not regard things present, but things ageless, and therefore no present and visible thing delights me. For we, that is, I and my brother Andrew, have grown up from our childhood not only orphans, but also extremely poor, and through necessity have become used to labor, which now also easily bear the fatigues of our journeyings. So again, you see that Kepha is commenting on his extremely poor manner of living. Matthew 6:24, no one is able to serve two masters. Either he'll hate the one and love the other, or he shall cleave to the one and despise the other. You're not able to serve Elohim and Mammon. And in Acts 4, with great power the emissaries gave witness to the resurrection of the Master Yeshua, and great favor was upon them all. For there was not anyone needy among them, for all who were possessors of lands or houses sold them and brought the prices of what was sold and laid them at the feet of the emissaries, and they distributed to each as anyone had need. So very similar as far as the what was said in Acts 4, comparing that to Josephus. Both mention the sharing everything in common with regards to their poverty and their poor manner of life, which again follows what Yeshua said about you can't serve Elohim and Mammon. Josephus goes on to say they think that oil is a defilement, and if any one of them be anointed without his own approbation, it is wiped off his body, for they think sweaty is a good thing, as they do also to be clothed in white garments. So you see this mention of oil, or a lack thereof, with regards to also clothed in white garments. Hippolytus says, no one, however, tastes these, speaking about the communal meal, before the priest utters a blessing and prays over the food, and after breakfast, when he has a second time offered up supplication, as at the beginning, So at the conclusion of their meal, they praise Elohim in hymns. Next, after they have laid aside as sacred the garments which they have been clothed, while together taking their repast within the house, now these garments are linen, and having resumed the clothes which they had left in the vestibule, they hasten to agreeable occupations until evening. So Hippolytus gives us another detail about the Essenes' way of life, that the white garments they're wearing were actually made of linen. Hegesippus, speaking about James, he says, James, the Lord's brother, succeeds to the government of the church in conjugation with the apostles. He has been universally called the just from the days of the Lord down to the present time. For many bore the name of James, but this one was wholly from his mother's womb. He drank no wine, nor other intoxicating liquor, nor did he eat flesh. No razor came upon his head. He did not anoint himself with oil, nor make use of the public bath. He alone was permitted to enter the holy place, for he did not wear any woolen garment, but fine linen only. So this sounds very similar to what we just read in Josephus and Hippolytus about the lifestyle of the Essenes. So what does it mean about not anointing yourself with oil? And this is something that I found kind of curious, in that we see several mentions of oil in the apostolic writings. Here are a couple of examples here where it says in Matthew 6, when you fast, don't be sad-faced like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces so that they appear to be fasting to men. Truly, I say to you, they have their reward, but when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face. And James himself, who we just read that he did not anoint himself with oil, it says, is anyone sick among you, let him call for the elders of the assembly, and let them pray over him, having anointed him with oil in the name of the master. So this is kind of a curious contradiction. One thing that I have been told is that in the first century, when they would anoint themselves with oil, they would basically saturate their hair with oil. And they believed it to be some manner of like cleanliness, to have this, oil in your hair, like to where your hair would be like dripping, like it was wet. And of course, this oil would then soak up all the dirt and the dust, and so it would actually be quite nasty if you think about it. So maybe this had to do more with, he did not anoint his head with oil as a manner of staying clean by not putting all this oil in his hair, which would be very different from what we would think of anointing someone with oil just by putting a little bit on their forehead. So I think this is maybe two different ways of anointing, or it could be when like an Aramaic oil, something that's like a perfume. Perhaps anointing someone with olive oil would be much different than anointing someone with a very expensive perfume. So like where the woman that was anointed, the woman that anointed Yeshua with the expensive oil, and she was criticized for it, maybe this was the type of anointing that they avoided, any kind of expensive oil. Again, this would kind of line up with their doctrine of, just having enough for what they needed. So expensive oil would be like an excess to them. Continuing on with this theme of oil and linen, Mark 9:2, after 6 days, Yeshua took Kepha and Yaakov and Yohanan and led them onto a high mountain alone by themselves, and he was transformed before them, and his garment became glittering, exceedingly white like snow, such as no longer on earth is able to whiten. And there appeared to them Elijah and Moshe, and they were talking with Yeshua. The fact that it doesn't say that his garments turned white, it said they just became exceedingly white, as if they had been laundered with OxyClean or something. So I kind of read this to think that Yeshua's garments were white initially, And then when he went up on top of the mountain, then they became exceedingly white, which may indicate that Yeshua was typically wearing white garments like the Essenes. Mark 16:5, and having entered into the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right, wearing a white robe, and they were greatly astonished. Revelation 3:4, nevertheless, you have a few names in Sardis who have not defiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white, because they are worthy. He who overcomes shall be dressed in white robes, and I shall by no means blot him out from the book of life. 7:9, after this I looked and saw a great crowd, which no one's able to count, out of all the nations and tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and the Lamb, dressed in white robes, palm branches in their hands. So you see this concept of white robes throughout the New Testament. These were just a few examples. Traveling customs. Josephus writes, they have no one certain city, but many of them dwell in every city, and if any of their sect comes from other places, what they have lies open for them just as if it were their own, and they go into such as they have never known before, as if they had been ever so long acquainted with them, for which reason they carry nothing at all with them when they travel into remote parts, though they still take their weapons with them, for fear of thieves. Accordingly, there is in every city where they live one appointed particularly to take care of strangers, to provide garments and other necessities for them, but the habit and management of their bodies is such as children use who are in fear of their masters, nor do they allow of the change of or shoes till it first be torn to pieces or worn out by time. So keep in mind, like if you notice that they go out and they carry nothing with them except for their weapons. When they go into a city, there's other Essenes there who will provide for their needs. So that's why they don't have to carry extra clothes, because there's always a network of Essene communities that they can go to. And that they don't even carry two pairs of shoes. They use one pair of shoes until they're falling apart, and then at that point they'll get a new pair of shoes. Philo says, in the first place, then, there is no one who has a house so absolutely his own private property that it does not in some sense also belong to everyone, for besides that they all dwell together in companies, the house is open to all those of the same notions who come to them from other quarters. Which just reinforces what Josephus says. Hippolytus, there is not one city of them, but many of them settle in every city, and if any of the adherents of the sect may be present from a strange place, they consider that all things are in common for him, and those whom they had not previously known they receive as if they belonged to their own household and kindred, and they traverse their native they traverse their native land, and on each occasion that they go on a journey they carry nothing except for arms. And they have also in their cities a president who extends the money collected for this purpose in procuring clothing and food for them. And the robe and its shape are modest, and they do not own two cloaks or a double set of shoes, and when those that are in present use become antiquated, then they adopt others. And they neither buy nor sell anything at all, but whatever anyone has he gives to him that has not, and that which one has not he receives. Okay, so we'll compare this to the Didache, which is an early apostolic writing, and it says, you will not turn away from the one in need. In fact, you will make your brother a partner in everything, not claiming anything to be your own. For if you're partners in the imperishable, how much more in the perishable? So notice it says your brother is a partner in everything. So your brother would, of course, be a fellow Nazarene, and this is in the midst of a section on taking care of travelers. So this, those in need was probably applied specifically to travelers. Chapter 16 says, watch over your own life. Do not allow your lights to be extinguished and your belt to be without a weapon, but you must be ready, because you do not know the hour in which our master comes. So in the same way that the Essenes always carried their weapons with them. We see that the Didache says, "Don't let your belt be without a weapon," which again lines up with what we see being said about the Essenes. Matthew chapter 5, Yeshua sent the 12 out and commanded them, saying, "Do not acquire gold or silver or copper for your money belts, a bag for the journey, or 2 undergarments, or sandals, or staffs, for the worker is worthy of his food. And into whatever city or village you enter, ask who's worthy in it, and stay there until you leave." So, in the same way that we see the Essenes going out without an extra set of clothes or an extra set of shoes, this is specifically what Yeshua gives as a commandment to them, that they are to go in and seek who is worthy. I believe that what that means when it says seek one who is worthy, that he's basically saying when you go into the city, ask who is an Essene, and then you go stay with them. Later on, after the Last Supper, when Yeshua is going out to the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, "When I sent you out without a purse and a bag and sandals, did you lack any?" And they said, "None at all." So that obviously means that somebody was providing this for them. And then he said to them, "But now let him who has a purse take it, and also a bag, and let him who has no sword sell his garment and buy one." So now Yeshua is giving the command to also carry a weapon, which lines up with what the Essenes were doing. Josephus says, "And as for their piety toward Elohim, it is very extraordinary, for before sun rising they speak not a word about profane matters, but put up certain prayers which they have received from their forefathers, as if they made a supplication for its rising. After which they assemble themselves together again into one place, and when they have clothed themselves in white veils, they then bathe their bodies in cold water." And Hippolytus says, "They continue in an orderly manner, and with perseverance pray from early dawn, and they do not speak a word unless they have praised Elohim in a hymn." So follow this up with Mark chapter 1, where it pictures Yeshua going out and praying before sunrise. So it appears that they were following the example set by Yeshua. Nazarene Acts also has this same sort of scenario where Kepha takes his disciples down to the harbor to bathe in the sea, and therefore they retire to a secret place for prayer early in the morning. And in Homilies 3 it says, "Clement and the rest of our companions," or "I, Clement, and the rest of our companions woke up about the second cock crowing and wanted to talk with Simon Kepha, and found his lamp still burning and Kepha kneeling in prayer." Panarian, in the travels, they have changed everything to suit themselves and slandered Peter in many ways, saying that he was baptized daily for purification as they are, and that the Ebionites received baptism apart from their daily baptisms. So basically there was a baptism to come into the group, into the Ebionites, but then you also followed that up with daily baptisms as part of your day-to-day lifestyle. And that's the same thing that, as Epiphanius says, he sees pictured in the travels of Peter. And so it's very similar to the way that the Essenes are described. Epiphanius goes on to say that he's going to discuss these other false accusations which they make against Peter and the other apostles, that every day before so much as eating bread, Kepha had immersions. They make lavish use of waters in their own reassurance to deceive themselves, if you please, under the impression that they have purification through baptism. So these Ebionites sound very similar to the Essenes. Josephus goes on to say, "They are eminent for fidelity, and are the ministers of peace. Whatsoever they say is also firmer than an oath, but swearing is avoided by them, and they esteem it worse than perjury, for they say that he who cannot be believed without swearing by Elohim is already condemned." Compare this to what Yeshua said. "Again, you heard it said of those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but perform your oaths to Yahuwah. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by the heaven, because it is Elohim's throne, nor the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king, nor swear by your head, because you're not able to make one hair white or black. But let your word be yea, and your no be no, and what goes beyond this is from the wicked one. So this sounds extremely similar to what the Essenes believed. We have a epistle of Peter to James that is mixed in with the Clementine writings. And in chapter 4, Kepha is concerned because there is this unnamed enemy, which sounds an awful lot like the Apostle Paul. And I say apostle with air quotes. The apostate Paul is taking Kepha's teachings and twisting them to suit his own agenda. And so now Kepha is telling James, don't share my teachings with everyone. Make them go through an initiation. And then before you give it to them, make them go through this ceremony. He says to take the person that he's going to give the books to, along with the books, and bring them to a river or a fountain, which is living water, where the regeneration of the righteous takes place, and should make him not swear, for that would be unlawful, but to stand by the water and adjure, as we ourselves, when we were regenerated, were made to do for the sake of not sinning. So Kepha mentions, whenever he's talking about this initiation, that they're not swearing by anything, they're just adjuring, because it's not lawful to swear, which again lines up with both Yeshua's instructions and the beliefs of the Essenes. Josephus says they also take great pains in studying the writings of the ancients, and choose out of them what is most for the advantage of their soul and body, and they inquire after such roots and medicinal stones as may cure their distempers. So, before I go on to what we know about the Jewish Christians, I just want to point out something that within the Vero Essene Yahad, and I would presume that the same could be said about you, the listener of this video right now, that this actually kind of describes us. These ancient writings that Josephus mentions, I see those as things like the Clementine writings and the apostolic constitutions and the writings of these historians and the Book of Enoch, that this really accurately describes the Vero Yahad, and if you're doing the same kind of research I am, it should describe you too. So I think even the modern day Essenes, this certainly is a description that we fit. In the Panarian, it says they make use of certain other books as well, supposedly the so-called Travels of Peter, written by Clement. Epiphanius says, then their so-called gospel says, I came to abolish sacrifices, and if you cease not from sacrificing, my wrath will not cease from you. They speak of other acts of the apostles, and they lay down certain ascents and instructions of James. So, again, you can see this description of the Ebionites as having these type of ancient documents that they used. Keep in mind, this was written around the year 400, so at that point, these documents they had would have been ancient. They would have been several hundred years old. And you can even see that in the book of Jude, where Jude admonishes the people that he's writing to. He says, compassion and peace and love be increased to you, beloved ones, making all haste to write to you concerning our common deliverance. I felt it necessary to write to you, urging you to earnestly contend for the belief which was once for all delivered to the set-apart ones. And I really believe that part of earnestly continuing or contending for the belief is to take the time to study these books. And, if you're not going to put in the time to learn, you're just going to be misled by somebody. So immediately after saying this in the book of Jude, Jude then goes on to list examples of our forefathers that have went through a similar situation as to what he is going through. There are these false brothers sneaking into the assemblies. Again, I take this to be speaking about Paul and his crew. And then he lists different episodes throughout history where a similar thing has happened. And he mentions, Moses and Enoch, and speaks about Sodom and Gomorrah. So it in itself also lines up with what Josephus said about them studying the books of the ancients. Josephus says, "But now if anyone has a mind to come over to their sect, he is not immediately admitted, but he is prescribed the same method of living which they use for a year, while he continues excluded, and they give him also a small hatchet, and the aforementioned girdle, and the white garment, and when he hath given evidence during that time that he can observe their continence, he approaches nearer to their way of living, and is made a partaker of the waters of purification. Yet is he not even now admitted to live with them, for after this demonstration of his fortitude, his temper is tried 2 more years, and if he appear to be worthy, they then admit him into their society, and before he is allowed to touch their common food, he is obligated to take a tremendous oath that in the first place he will exercise piety toward Elohim, and then that he will observe justice toward men, and that he will do no harm to anyone, either of his own accord or by the command of others." So notice that before the new initiate is permitted to have table fellowship, he has to go through a period of initiation, including a baptism or the waters of purification. We see a similar concept in the Nazarene Acts. When Kepha had thus spoken, he retired to take food along with his Havarim, but he ordered me to eat by myself. And this is Clement speaking, of course. And after the meal, while he had sung praises to Yahuwah and given many thanks, he rendered to me an account of this proceeding, and added, "May Elohim grant to you to be made like us in all things, that receiving mikvah, you may be able to meet with us at the same table." So you don't really see the year-long initiation, but you do see the requirement for the new initiate to accept the waters of baptism unto repentance. Kepha goes on to say, "For this I would have you know for certain that everyone who has at any time worshipped idols and has adored those whom the pagans call Elohim, or has eaten of the things sacrificed to them, is not without an unclean spirit, for he has become a guest of demons, and has been a partaker with that demon of which he has formed the image in his mind, either through fear or love. And by these means he is not free from an unclean spirit, and therefore needs the purification of mikvah, that the unclean spirit may go out of him, which has made its abode in the innermost affections of his spirit, and what is worse, gives no indication that it lurks within, for fear that it shall be exposed and expelled." So now you see the reason why Kepha would not allow Clement to eat with them until he had had mikvah, is because Kepha was concerned about opening himself up for harassment from unclean spirits. He goes on to say, let no one of you therefore be saddened at being separated from eating with us, for everyone who ought to observe that it is for just so long a time as he pleases, but he who wishes soon to be immersed is separated but for a little time, but he for a longer time who wishes to be immersed later. Everyone therefore has it in his own purpose to demand a shorter or a longer time for repentance, and therefore it lies with you, when you wish it, to come to our table, and not with us, who are not permitted to take food with anyone who has not been immersed. It is rather you, therefore, who hinder us from eating with you, if you interpose delays on the way of your purification and defer your mikvah. So this reflects 2 concerns. So I guess the first concern is that the initiates had, for a period, avoided eating anything offered to an idol or any kind of unclean meat. According to the homilies, it's any kind of meat at all, that all dead flesh is a dwelling place of demons, and so if you eat meat at all, then you're opening yourselves up to demonic oppression. And then that once they got off of the meat, then the people were immersed, and the immersion would drive the evil spirits out of them. This may be the concept behind James's instructions in the book of Acts, that they write to the Gentiles who are turning to Elohim, that they should abstain from the defilements of idols, from whoring, from what is strangled, and from blood. For from ancient generations Moshe has been read in every city. So these are the same things that Kepha is attributing to demonic oppression. And so we see in Galatians this episode where Kepha came to Antioch to meet the members of Paul's congregation, and at some point some people showed up from James in Jerusalem, and when they showed up, Kepha withdrew himself from eating with the Gentiles. Now, all we have is Paul's side of the story, and we don't really have the details of what exactly the discussion was about. What was the reason that Peter was withdrawing himself? Now, Paul says it was out of fear of those of the circumcision, but I tend to think that it has something to do with the fact that Paul had left Jerusalem saying that he was going to uphold the decisions of James in the Jerusalem assembly, and then later on he's saying things like, go ahead and eat meat offered to an idol, that an idol's not anything in the world, and so you're not better off or worse off for eating or not eating. And I think that possibly Peter was informed that Paul had not been following their instructions, and that Paul was kind of allowing these Gentiles to continue eating tainted meat, and that was probably the reason that Kepha withdrew from table fellowship. And the fact of the matter is that Paul himself admits that everybody turned against him, including Barnabas, which leads me to think that Paul was the one who actually ended up getting rebuked and not Kepha. Josephus goes on to say that he will always hate the wicked, this is continuing on with the oath, always be assistant to the righteous, that he will ever show fidelity to all men, and especially to those in authority, because no one obtains the leadership without Elohim's assistance, and that if he be in authority, he will at no time whatever abuse his authority, nor endeavor to outshine his subjects, either in his garments or other finery, that he will be perpetually a lover of truth, and propose to himself to reprove those that tell lies, that he will keep his hand clear from theft, and his soul from unlawful gains, and that he will neither conceal anything from those of his own sect, nor discover any of their doctrines to others, no, not though anyone should compel him, even so at the hazard of his life. Moreover, he swears to communicate their doctrines to no one any otherwise than as he received them himself, that he will abstain from robbery, and will equally preserve the books belonging to their sect, and the names of the angels. These are the oaths by which they secure their proselytes to themselves. So, this concept of keeping your doctrines secret, you see that reflected in Yeshua when his apostles ask him, why do you speak to these people in parables? And Yeshua says, because it has been given to you to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. And do not give what is set apart to the dogs, nor throw your pearls before pigs. And then we see in the epistle of Peter to James, we've already mentioned this epistle, but when Yaakov read the letter, he sent for the Zachanim, and having read it to them, said, our Kepha has strictly and becomingly charged us concerning the establishing of the truth, that we should not communicate the scrolls of his preachings, which have been sent to us, to anyone at random, but to one who is good and obedient, and who wishes to teach, and who is circumcised and fruitful. And these are not to be committed to him at once, that if he be found injudicious in the first, the others may not be entrusted to him. For this reason, let him be proved not less than 6 years. And let him say, I take to witness heaven, earth, and water, in which all things are comprehended, and in addition to all these, that air also which pervades all things, and without which I cannot breathe, that I shall always be obedient to him who gives me the books of the preachings, and that those same books which he may give me I shall not communicate to anyone in any way or manner whatsoever, communicating them to another, unless I shall ascertain one to be worthy. Again, you see this phrase of being worthy related to members of the sect of the Nazarenes, and I believe that to refer to the ones that are worthy are the Essenes, as I myself have been judged. And in addition to all these things, if I shall lie, I shall be accursed, living and dying, and I shall be punished with everlasting punishment. And again, this is and of course I've cut out a lot of this oath because it was very long, but notice it is the same terms that Josephus just said that these people, that the Essenes had to swear to. So you see this oath lining up with the oath that Josephus described with the Essenes. And it says, and after this, let him partake of bread and salt with him who commits them to him. So why is the mention of salt? Well, it's because they're forming a covenant of salt. So that's why Kepha didn't want to sit down and have table fellowship with people who were not living a righteous life, because when you sitting down in table fellowship is a type of covenant that you cut with someone in the ancient Near East, especially if salt is being served on the table. And so Kepha did not want to come into covenant with or fellowship with someone who was infected by demons. And I've mentioned it before in several of my videos that I was always taught in church that once you say the sinner's prayer, you've got like this, Jesus force field around you, and that the demons have no control over you whatsoever. But yet we see Kepha here being very careful about avoiding any kind of chance of being in the vicinity of someone who is infected with demonic activity. And James, having thus spoken, the elders were in agony of terror. Therefore James, perceiving that they were greatly afraid, said, Hear me, brethren and fellow servants, if we shall give the books to all indiscriminately, and they should be corrupted by any daring men, or be perverted by interpretations, as you have heard that some have already done, it will remain even for those who really seek the truth always to wander in error. Wherefore it is better that they should be with us, and that we should communicate them with all aforementioned care to those who wish to live piously and to save others. But if anyone after taking this adjuration shall act otherwise, he shall with good reason incur eternal punishment. For why should not he who is the cause of the destruction of others not be destroyed himself? So notice that the people were terrified when they read this oath that James was going to make them take. So now you understand why Josephus says that the Essenes would protect the teachings up into the point of death, because they had taken this oath that would basically condemn themselves into eternal torment if they broke their oath. And the reason is because James understood it. If these writings were lost or corrupted, we would be in the situation we are now, where people like me and you are sitting here trying to reverse engineer these doctrines and trying to figure out, well, what was it that these original followers of Yeshua believed? Because now earnestly contending for the faith once delivered to the saints is turned into a detective mystery. And I'm sure that the Father has left the information that we need to get the truth. But it's taken a lot of work on our behalf. In the Panarian, it says that speaking about the Ebionites, that the Gospel of John is translated from Greek to Hebrews in the Jewish treasuries, the treasuries at Tiberias, and that it is stored there secretly. I would submit to you, I think it was originally written in Hebrew and then translated to Greek, but it is what it is. And not only that, but it said that the book of the Acts of the Apostles is also translated from Greek to Hebrew, is there in the treasuries. They speak of other Acts of the Apostles in which there is much thoroughly impious material. So notice that that Epiphanius does not actually have a copy of these other Acts of the Apostles. He said that they speak of them. They mention that they have these books, but apparently Epiphanius is not privy to them. So again, you see this concept of them keeping some of their teachings held in secret. Okay, that's the end of this part. There is a part 2, which I will get up as soon as possible. And I thank you for listening tonight. You have a good rest of the evening, and shalom.